Julie O'Connell. I'm here with my friend.
Speak up.
I'm here with my friend, violinist Linda Finigan. We met a few years ago as a result of our mutual transitions to South Carolina. She came from New York and I came from Maryland. We've been playing together ever since then, chamber music at various times. We're going to play for you. Linda is a violinist and teacher. She has played in a number of orchestras in New York, and she is currently a member of the first violin section of the Long Bay Symphony. We are going to play for you some pieces for violin and piano. We're going to start with a sonata by a composer named Jean-Marie Leclair, who was a French violinist who lived during the first half, of the 18th century. So he's kind of a contemporary of Bach. He was both a violinist and a composer, kind of in the tradition of some of the other early Baroque composers like Arcangelo Corelli, and he's considered to be the founder of the French violin school. We're going to play one of his violin sonatas. It consists of 4 very short movements, which are supposed to be played more or less consecutively without pausing in between. This one is entitled Le Tombeau, which in musical terms means a musical tombstone or a musical tribute or memorial for somebody who's died. It's not clear from my looking at the literature whether there was he actually had somebody in mind who died, or whether it was just called Le Tombeau because it has the characteristics of a tombeau, which was a musical form at the time. For example, some of the characteristics of a tombeau that you will hear, particularly if you listen to the first movement, are lots of repeated notes, da 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 da. This is supposed to represent knocking of death on the door. You'll also hear a lot of scales. Up scales are supposed to describe the soul's ascendance. Down scales are supposed to describe the soul's tribulation. There's also a very characteristic figure which is called a soprano, and it sounds like this. 3 notes up and 1 note down. This is probably a moan or a groan or something like that. Also, you'll hear a lot of drum beats in the piano in the first movement. A couple other characteristics that I wanted to bring to your attention is first movement particularly has a lot of double stops in the violin. Double stops are where you play 2 strings at once. It's pretty difficult because not only do you have to get the left hand really in tune on the notes, but you have to have really good bow control because you have to be able to play on both strings at the same time. So particularly in the first movement, there are lots of double stops in the violin, which was a characteristic of Leclair's writing for violin. And the last thing I want to mention is that another characteristic of Leclair's writing is lightness and agility of the bow. Particularly in the bow during the time that he was living was going through a transformation from a shape like this above the hair to a flatter shape more like this above the hair. And he was in the transitional period. But you will hear, particularly in the second movement, a lot of bow going off the string, which you have to you put a little bit of pressure on the bow and then it naturally bounces for you along the string. This is not an easy thing to do. It's not something you do in the first year of learning to play the violin. But you can listen for these things as we play the piece. Our next set of pieces is going to be two short pieces by a composer named Anton Arensky, who was a Russian composer who lived during the latter part of the 19th century, so he was a romantic composer. He taught at the Moscow Conservatory. My piano teacher in Maryland, who also taught at the Moscow Conservatory before he came to the United States, feels that Arensky is one of the underappreciated composers. And these are two very nice pieces. The pieces we're going to play are from his Opus 3, which is pretty early. So these are probably student compositions while he was studying at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. The first piece is entitled Berceuse, which means cradle song or lullaby. And the second piece is titled Serenade, which you know what that is. And one thing I want to call your attention to is for the lullaby, Linda's going to be playing her violin part of the time with a mute on, so you can listen for the different tone colors that the mute, it dampens down the frequencies and cuts down the amount of vibration that goes into the violin. It goes right on the top of the bridge. So you can listen for the different tone colors that putting the mute on produces. Next, we are going to play some movements of a sonatina by Franz Schubert, who lived in the early part of the 19th century. He died, by the way, at age 31, even younger than Mozart. He was an Austrian composer He's considered to be a successor of Beethoven, along with Mendelssohn in the early Romantic period. He was Austrian, and he's noted for beautiful melodies, particularly. He wrote, and he was also noted for writing a lot of vocal music. He wrote over 600 pieces for voice of various kinds. He also wrote over 7 symphonies, and a lot of piano music, and a lot of chamber music. We're going to play 2 movements of a sonatina that was part of a set of 3 little sonatinas for violin and piano that was written in 1816 when he was 19, but it was not published until about 8 years after he died, so it has a very large opus number. We're going to play the 2nd and 3rd movements of this sonatina. One of the characteristics that's really nice for us as players is this is a real duet. It goes back and forth between the violin and the piano. Sometimes the piano has the melody and the violin accompanies, and sometimes the violin has the melody and the piano accompanies. So we're going to play 2 movements. The 2nd movement is what's called the ABA song form. So you hear material at the beginning, and then there's something different in the middle, and then you hear the same material at the end. The third movement is called a rondo, which is in a way kind of an expansion of the ABA form. You hear material at the beginning, then you hear something different, and then the beginning material comes back again, and then you hear something different, and then the beginning material comes back again. So you can listen for what you hear at the beginning to keep reappearing during the movement. So this is Schubert Sonatina, D major. The last piece we're going to play is an arrangement. The original composer was Isaac Albéniz, who lived during the latter half of the 19th century. He's a Spanish piano virtuoso and also composer who wrote a lot of music, mainly for piano, but quite a bit of music. We're going to play a tango, which was part of a set of 6 pieces for piano that was composed in 1860. This piece is very popular in arrangements for guitarists, but we're going to play an arrangement by a man named Fritz Kreisler, who was a very famous violinist in the early part of the 20th century. He was Viennese, and he was also a very gifted composer. I have a funny story about him. My father was on the faculty at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor when we were growing up, and he was very interested in athletics, college athletics, because he thought it was an opportunity for kids with not very much money to attend college. And so, but he was on the board of athletics, and the head of the athletic department at the time was named Fritz Kreisler. I heard his name all the time, Fritz Kreisler, Fritz Kreisler. And I was about 10, and I was starting to study violin, so I was becoming acquainted with violin literature. And of course, I heard about the great violinist Fritz Kreisler. And for a while, I always wondered how this man could possibly manage to be both the athletic director at the University of Michigan and a very famous violinist. I got it sorted out after a little while. Eventually, I did get it sorted out. Anyway, this is an example of what beautiful music 2 great composers can make when they're working together.